Hi, Modern World History students. We are in Unit 10, 20th and 21st Century Nationalism. You remember what nationalism is. This is the desire of each nation to govern itself and not be governed by outsiders. But you also remember that during the 19th century, the Europeans, particularly the European countries that were very modern and very industrialized, they had gone out and they had conquered big chunks of the world. Um, they had conquered, most of Africa and big parts of Asia and the Pacific Islands, and they conquered those nations and took their land and ruled over them as part of their empire. Well, now in the 20th and 21st centuries, those nations who were conquered and ruled over by the Europeans back in the 19th century began to experience nationalism. That is, the desire to govern themselves. And so during this time in the 20th century, those nations will finally get rid of the Europeans, kick the Europeans out, and begin governing themselves. And that's really the story of this unit. And we're working through three different regions of the world. One of those is the Indian subcontinent, another one, sub-Saharan Africa, and then finally what we today call the Middle East. And we're in the Indian subcontinent right now. And the main character, the most important character, I guess the most famous character in the story of how India became independent from the British is Mohandas Gandhi. So I'm going to provide you with just a sort of very basic introduction to Mohandas Gandhi and the India that he grew up in. So I'm up at the top of page 7 here. And first of all, a little review. So originally, when the British became really invested in India, it was the British East India Company that was kind of allowed to run the show. So the British East India Company was a joint stock company that was created to make money, to make profit by exporting raw materials from India to England and then selling them, at a profit, right? And in time, the main raw material that the British began to import from India was cotton, because of course Britain had become an industrialized society, and the very first of their industries to become industrialized was the textile industry, the industry of making cloth, and cotton was the main raw material that they required to make into cloth. And so the British East India Company was exporting cotton as well as other raw materials from India out to Britain and making a ton of money that way. But if you remember, there was a rebellion against the British East India Company. The British East India Company had hired native Indian sort of security forces, soldiers really, called sepoys. And those sepoys provided security for all of the investments of the British East India Company in India. But those sepoys rebelled against the company, and the company was not able to manage the rebellion, and so the British government had to step in. And from that point on, the British government played a more intense role in governing India. Now, you remember that was 1857. So from 1857 really until 1947, the British government ruled India. Now, you remember, though, that the British approach to ruling nations whom they'd conquered was called indirect rule. So the British, they didn't like getting their hands dirty if they could avoid it. As much as possible, they tried to recruit native people to do as much of the day-to-day work of governing as possible, so that the British didn't have to send their own people to do that. So functions like delivering the mail, collecting taxes, inspecting roads and bridges, policing, a lot of the really, really important functions of government are just day-to-day functions that keep society moving forward, right? So the British tried to get as many native Indians to continue to perform those functions as possible. And then as you worked your way up the chain of command from those levels up toward the top, where it was more about decision making and big picture and how are we going to run this society, then as you worked your way up to the top, that's where you began to see the British take a bigger and bigger role. And so, for example, in India, at the very top of that chain of command was a viceroy. And the man on the left here is a British viceroy. And it's his job to govern India on behalf of the monarch of England, the Queen or the King. And so he was at the top of the chain of command. But the viceroy had a council, an advisory council. And that advisory council included native Indians as well as British. So before the British took over India, large sections of India were ruled by native kings called Rajas. And so oftentimes Rajas served on the advisory council, the Viceroy's council, to advise the British on how to govern India. So the British approach to governing India was kind of a shared governance approach, what we call indirect rule, where most of the day-to-day work was done by native Indians and even some of the advising. But in the end, the Indians didn't govern themselves. In the end, it was the British who were calling the shots. And the British invested huge amounts of money into infrastructure in India, building a railway network that was actually had more miles of rails in it than all of Europe combined. But the function of this railway network was really to serve the British. It was to help export um, raw materials out of the interior of India out to the coast so it could be then sent off to Britain. So the British did make huge investments in India, but in the end, the basic view of India was that it was a resource for Britain to be exploited, both in terms of its raw materials and in terms of its market. So, India today has almost a billion people. Indian subcontinent has almost a billion people. Um, Even back then, we're talking about hundreds of millions who might be purchasers of British manufactured goods. So, if you remember something called mercantilism, where you make profit for yourself by maximizing or by importing less value from someone than what you export to them, by importing cheap raw materials and then exporting to them expensive manufactured goods. And then money flows your direction because what you're importing from them is cheaper than what you're exporting to them. The British were using India in that way as well, making profit by importing cheap raw materials like cotton, but then exporting to them expensive finished goods like cloth. And as a result, many Indians became dependent on the British for cloth. And they found that their own native skills, they had been spinners of thread and weavers of cloth for centuries, for millennia. They had done those things for themselves, but gradually those native skills began to disappear because they came to rely more and more on British manufactured goods. So you can see where what was called the British Raj, and the Raj was the name that the British gave to this sort of arrangement for governing India. The British Raj served the British very well, didn't necessarily serve the Indians well, although the Indians perhaps had a bigger role in governing themselves than native nations had who were ruled by sort of other European countries like the French or the Belgians or the Italians. Now, it's into this environment that Mohandas Gandhi was born. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born in 1869, and he was the son of, let's go with this first of all. His family belonged to the caste called Vaisya. So by now, we've taken a very brief look at Hinduism, and you remember that there are castes, social classes. And at the top of that were priests called Brahmins, and then there were warriors called Kshatriyas, and then Vaisyas, who were sort of originally landowning farmers, and then also merchants when Indian society evolved to become more trade based, and then at the bottom Shudras, who were servants who owned no land. Um, the three castes at the top were privileged castes. Um, and Mohandas Gandhi's family were Vaisyas. They belonged to that caste that were the landowning farmers and the merchants. So they were a privileged caste. And as a matter of fact, Mohandas Gandhi's father was an advisor to a Raja. So remember that sections of India had been governed by Rajas. These Rajas were now cooperating with the British, and Gandhi's father was the advisor to one of these Rajas who was cooperating with the British. And because of that, Gandhi had access to privileges that that other Indians perhaps would not have access to. Now, Gandhi was not a great student, not particularly intensely dedicated to his studies um, in India. But because he was the son of an advisor to a Raja, he had the privilege, he had the opportunity to attend university in Britain. That was one of the privileges that the British used to sort of keep native Indian leadership on their side and working with them and cooperating with them. That was something that the British did as part of the British Raj. They offered privileges, whether it would be when automobiles came along, access to automobiles, or access to university education in Britain, which the best universities, some of them in the world, were in Britain, or whether it was nicer housing or something like that. The British offered these special privileges to Indian leaders who would work with them, or native leaders wherever the British ruled who would work with them. And so for Mohandas Gandhi, what this meant was that he would be able to attend the university in Britain. Despite the fact that he wasn't necessarily very committed to his studies in India, he would be allowed to attend a university in Britain. And so he traveled to Britain to attend a university. And one of the things that Gandhi observed, he was studying law, because if he would study law and become qualified in British law, then he could follow his father's footsteps, and he could become an advisor and play an important role in Britain's government in India, the British colonial government in India. He could play a role in that because he would be trained in British law. And as a matter of fact, he could get a job practicing law all over the world, because the British Empire was a global empire, and British law prevailed throughout that empire. And so a person trained in British law could work anywhere in the empire. But Gandhi's father had in mind that Gandhi would return to India and play a role in Britain's colonial government there, just as he did. So, in studying British law at a university in Britain, Gandhi was introduced to all of the sort of fundamentals of British law. So, strong education in Jewish and Christian background, for example, because a lot of British law and American law too is grounded then in the ethics of Judaism and Christianity. And one of the things that Gandhi observed about Judaism and Christianity, along with Greek philosophy, by the way, and Roman law. So he also studied Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy has a lot of influence on British law and American law. So he studied Jewish and Christian ethics, Greek philosophy, and one of the things that Gandhi discovered there was that a lot of the most important fundamental principles of Jewish and Christian ethics and of Greek philosophy were very similar to the ethics of Hinduism and Islam, which, of course, he had direct experience with being a native of India. Hinduism, of course, was the dominant religion of India. Again, you've gotten a little tiny introduction to that by now. But you'll find, if you haven't already had that lesson yet, you'll find that Islam has significant influence in India as well. As a matter of fact, India has the second largest Muslim population of any country in the world today. And what Gandhi discovered upon studying Jewish and Christian ethics and Greek philosophy is that these Western, what we would call Western philosophies, had so much in common, so much was similar about them with Hinduism and Muslim ethics. And most importantly, a fundamental belief that every human being's life was valuable, was worth something. And therefore, that every human being ought to be treated with some measure of dignity and respect. And that was something that had an important had made a real impression on Mohandas Gandhi, because he came to conclude that this idea that every human life was valuable, and therefore that every human ought to be treated with some level of dignity and respect, he came to view that as a universal truth. In other words, it's true everywhere. Universal means that it's true everywhere and in all situations. And that then became the basis for a lot of his own personal philosophies. And as he developed an idea of a strategy for how to combat British imperialism, as he began to develop a strategy for liberating nations in India from British rule, what you'll see is that idea that every life has value and that every person ought to be treated with dignity has a central place in him developing that philosophy. So he also developed another thing that came out of his university education. He developed a strong sense that the British system of government was the best system in the world. That the British system of government, with its the powers of government broken into branches, an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch, with the executive, with the legislative branch elected by the people, with a very clear statement of rights, a very clear statement of what the limits of the government's power were, very clear statement of what the government was allowed to do and what the government was not allowed to do. Those are all characteristics of the British system of government. And then you say, well, that sounds a lot like the American system of government. Well, sure, because we inherited a lot. We too were inspired by the British system. We inherited a lot of that British system because we were a British colony ourselves. Originally, we were British colonies, right? Um, so he developed a sense of deep respect for that system. And he concluded that system of government, the British system, particularly this idea of limited government, that there are clear limits on the powers of government, he believed that system was the one that was best designed to guarantee that individuals will be treated with the kind of respect and dignity that they deserve. He had great respect for the British system of government. He really did believe that those limits and the breaking up of government power into branches and that kind of thing was designed to provide a system that would be most likely to ensure that people's rights were not trampled on and that individual people were treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. So these are things that he learned from his experience as a university student in Britain, learning the law, and he takes that with him where he goes. Now, where he went immediately after graduating was South Africa, because at that point, he's qualified to practice law. And as I said, he's qualified to practice anywhere in the British Empire because the British law prevails throughout the British Empire. And he traveled to South Africa, and South Africa had a large population of Indians living there who had emigrated from India, immigrated into South Africa, um, and they were referred to in South Africa as colored people. So you got to think back, but remember that South Africa was a country that, although part of the British Empire, was governed by the descendants of the original European inhabitants or the original European colonizers of South Africa, who were Dutch, called Afrikaners or Boers. So the Dutch were the first Europeans to settle in South Africa. The British then took over South Africa. But after almost a century of struggle, the British had agreed to allow the Dutch, who called themselves Afrikaners, to do most of the governing there. But the Afrikaners had practiced slavery before the time of the British Empire. The Afrikaners had practiced slavery. The British had outlawed slavery. So the Afrikaners had instituted a policy called apartheid. And under apartheid, basically it was a way of putting Native Africans, that is black Africans, putting them in a permanent position of inferiority in society. Not slavery, because the British had outlawed that, but a position of inferiority, much like we saw in the states of the Deep South in the United States, even after our country ended slavery. And that system was called apartheid. Well, apartheid applied to people who were also called colored, so people from India. So they weren't Native Africans, but they weren't white Europeans either. And when Gandhi was practicing law in South Africa, he, of course, discovered that this policy of apartheid applied to him. And there was a famous incident where he had purchased a first-class ticket to travel on a train to go from one location in South Africa to another. And Gandhi was fairly light-skinned, and so the ticket agent who sold him the first-class ticket didn't register for him, went ahead and sold him a first-class ticket. The problem was that black Africans, as well as colored people like Gandhi, were not permitted to travel first class on trains in South Africa. But Gandhi had a first class ticket. So he boarded the first class coach, which meant nothing to him because he had always traveled first class. In Britain, for example, it was permitted. And in India, of course, it was permitted. And as a privileged person, he'd always traveled first class. But in South Africa, this was not permitted. And he was ordered to give up his seat and go into one of the coaches in the rear of the train. And he refused to do it. And so at the next station, he was physically ejected from the train, forced off onto the platform. And this is sort of the beginning of Gandhi's education and how the privilege that he had grown up with in India and enjoyed in Britain, didn't apply everywhere. And so he began a campaign, a nonviolent campaign. We'll talk a lot more about nonviolence, to try to gain more rights for these so-called colored people, that is, Indian people, and also for Africans as well in South Africa. The movement that he began in South Africa, a strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience, again, more on that soon, that also became a movement that encompassed trying to gain more rights for Africans. Now, Gandhi was focused more on gaining more rights for what were called colored people. But then in 1915, he left South Africa to return to India, and he will take his strategy and his philosophy with him. Now, when Gandhi returned to India, by that time, for 30 years, there had already existed an organization called the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress had been founded in 1885, and it was a group of Indians, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Indians of every every religious belief, Indians from all over India speaking many different languages originally, different nations of people from the Indian subcontinent. They had formed, and they were nationalists. It's called the Indian National Congress. They were nationalists. They were seeking to gain greater rights of self-government for Indians in the Indian subcontinent. Did they want independence from the British Empire? Well, there was disagreement about that. There were some within the Indian National Congress who did insist that independence from the British was the only way for Indians to truly be able to self-govern or to get justice or fairness, fair treatment, decent treatment. So some within the Indian National Congress advocated independence. That must be the goal. Others believed that India could continue to be part of the British Empire and enjoy what benefits that entailed to India, but all that they were demanding was for Indians to play a greater role in governing themselves. So what did that mean? Well, you got to sort that out, right? So the Indian National Congress was divided. Again, some insisting on independence, others not, simply greater role in governing themselves. And when Gandhi returned to India, he became a member of Indian National Congress, and as a matter of fact, was very quickly elected as its president. His reputation from the work that he had done in South Africa to gain greater rights for Indians, or as they were called under apartheid, colored people in South Africa. His efforts had given him a reputation, so that even before he returned to India, he was well known, well respected in the Indian National Congress. So when Gandhi returned to India in 1915, he was elected the president of the Indian National Congress, and the question was, which side will he come down on? Will he be down on the side of independence for India, or will he be down on the side of independence is not necessary? We just want a greater role for governing ourselves. So we'll see how that goes. But that's it for now. So take care of yourselves, modern world history students. Hang in there, and we'll talk to you soon.